broadening our perspective again a little bit, can you speak briefly about the association between environmental degradation and racism?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a big connection. I had recently reviewed a paper on climate change and looking at the hot spots in the country and then overlaying that with where Black people live. And many Black communities are made vulnerable to climate change more so than other communities. And we're also located near water a lot. And so when environmental disasters happen, Black and brown people are almost always disproportionately impacted because of environmental racism. And so, but this is another instance, yet another instance, that if we really centered Black people in our conversations on climate change, we would come up with solutions that would help everyone. Because if you can help those who are most struggling, everyone benefits from policy. So for me, there's a clear connection between the environment and racism because Black people are often forced to live in areas that were the most hazardous. And so when we address address environmental racism, we're really addressing or making the world a better place for everyone.
You have a phrase that you often refer back to. There is nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that phrase means and how it centers your work?
Yeah, whenever something goes wrong in Black communities, you'll hear people say, well, they weren't raised right, or what they do over there. They need to pull up their pants, they need to cut their hair, all kind of other things. And people are blamed and not the policies that created the conditions that lead to some of the things that we don't want to see in the community. And I'll give you a very personal example. My father was a heroin addict. He probably abused my mother. He was in and out of prison. He was murdered in prison in Detroit or outside Detroit in Jackson State Penitentiary, now known as Michigan State Penitentiary. In my research where I looked at where he lived in areas where there was lower housing devaluation, redlining, urban renewal, highway construction that barreled through his neighborhood, forcing them to leave. He was surrounded by racial housing covenants. There's no question. If you didn't see that racism, he probably wouldn't have ended up he would certainly had more resources to go to college, start a business, had better schools. His behavior, drug use probably wouldn't be criminalized. He probably wouldn't have ended up in jail. He probably wouldn't have been murdered in jail. And I hate when people say, they ask me this question, they'll say, well, what made you so different? And I'll go, no. One, my father should have been my father could have been sitting in this seat, relatively speaking. And he didn't. Instead he was murdered in a prison. And so how many people do we have to lose? We see what can be when some of the folks fall through those cracks and are upheld by a people who just refuse to allow me to fall. But the reality is, for every one of me, there's more that are just struggling, who got better grades, put more work in, did all these different things, and they still couldn't get a fair shot. And so I'm no different from my father, no different. He should have been where I am today. And so we just keep robbing people of opportunity to reach their potential. So for me, where do I get my good looks and my smarts? From my father. But he ended up one place and I ended up in another.
Thank you for sharing that with us. And how an example of the systems that surround us can, really do shape what our access to opportunity is. And that's what we're talking about here. So thank you so much for sharing that. Speaking of kind of access and opportunity, there is a widely read essay by Ta-Nehisi Coates, The Case for Reparations. And the case he makes is that government engineered housing discrimination is the basis for his call for reparations. Do you support a program of reparations to address a racial wealth gap created by government policy in housing and elsewhere?
Oh, absolutely. I support a program of reparations. And America believes in reparations, except for when it comes to Black people. We believe in, just a few weeks of being socially distanced, the business community rose up and said, we need the federal government to make us whole. We need stimulus, reparations. We need the federal government to respond. And it did, except for Black people. 95% of Black people Black firms were excluded from that initial rollout of the PPP loan program. But although it was not sufficient, and a lot of Native Americans don't believe that they actually receive reparations. There was at least a superficial offering of reparations to Native Americans, Japanese who were interned. Again, woefully insufficient. I would never say that they received all that they deserved. But there was some offering to the Japanese in turn, 9/11 victims. And then clearly internationally, when you're talking about victims of the Holocaust, receive reparations. So reparations is not this strange thing that people pretended to be. Only when it comes to Black people do we say, who's going to pay for it? I didn't own any slaves, and these kind of silly remarks. And just to address that, you're not paying for reparations. The federal government is, state government, municipalities. Just like I haven't used a federal highway in South Dakota, my tax dollars go towards those federal highways. So, this idea that we can't have reparations is ridiculous. And there's reparations for different things, or different claims for different injuries. Slavery, certainly the not receiving wages. There should be a check cut for the descendants of the enslaved. When you're talking about housing discrimination, redlining, we know who lived in those areas. We know who were denied. We know where they lived. We can create a program to restore the value that has been extracted or denied to Black people. We can do that. And so this is something we should and can do. And actually, it is happening. Reparations is happening. It's happening all over the country. Evanston instituted a reparations program. Asheville, North Carolina, introduced something. Virginia is attempting a reparations program around higher ed. California, Maryland, other states. I say this, that reparations won't come from Washington. It'll go to Washington. And so, and what we're seeing now is a reparative culture starting to emerge. Before, it was a culture of white supremacy, of exclusivity, that led to this policy violence from federal, state, and local levels. Now we're seeing people say, you know what, I want a reparative culture. I want to help solve these problems. And it's leading to reparations programs all across the country. And eventually, they'll bubble up to the federal level. And then you'll see a more robust program, because at a local level, they'll be woefully insufficient. But when you pair that with federal or state and other responses, corporate responses, then you can get at that wealth gap that sees white families having about 170,000 of median wealth. These are 2016 numbers, Fed Reserve numbers, compared to $17,000 for Black families. We are seeing a reparative culture emerge, and that's encouraging. And when it starts to spread, and it's going to be a fight, there's going to be a fight. You know, you still have these insurrectionists and Trumpers and these folks who would rather bring democracy down than to see equality or equity. I mean, which is ridiculous. I mean, this is ridiculous.
Than to set up a social safety net that would save us all, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, you know, and it's really mind-boggling how people vote against their own interests.
It is.
You know, there are more poor white people, you know, in absolute numbers than Black people. It's white people who need health care. It's white people who need better schools. It's white people who need their debt canceled and all these other things. You know, people cut their nose to spite their face all the time because racism compelled them that at least I'm better than the Black person. I mean, and it's like, I mean, it's sad. It is really sad. It's pathetic, sad, embarrassing. But this is why we do this work. Because you know, one, I don't want to see Black people bear the brunt of that ignorance, of that, you know, that callousness. And we are. But I also feel that a lot of people can be delivered when we restore the value that's been extracted by racism.
I like that. I like that. That's good. So
you know, every once in a while, I'll say something that
I had to think. I had to stop there and think about that. I was like, that's really good. And then I had to think about it again. That was good. Thank you so much. So to end with that great statement and this kind of follow-up question of, we've talked about policy, we've talked about kind of grand patterns in the US. What about the average person? What ways do you think the average person can address racism in the US?
Oh man, in my latest book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities, available wherever fine books are sold. I got the title Know Your Price from my favorite play in the whole wide world, Two Trains Running, written by the late great August Wilson. And in the play, the main character, Memphis, is about to have his property seized through eminent domain by the city of Pittsburgh. The city of Pittsburgh offers the main character, Memphis, $15,000 for his property. And the main character, Memphis, says, that's too low. I know my price. I got my price. And it's a refrain throughout the play. I know my price. I got my price. I'm paraphrasing, but he goes back and forth with the city. There's another character, Hambo, who agrees to paint a fence for a proprietor in exchange for a ham. So he paints the fence, Hambo paints the fence, but he never gets his ham. And we don't know if he has mental illness before or after he agreed to paint the fence, but eventually he goes mad, demanding his ham. Give me my ham, give me my ham. And he dies demanding his ham. Now, there's actually a happy ending. I know people are like, oh, that's not good. There's a happy ending. The main character, Memphis, gets 36,000, well above the original offer for his restaurant, his property, and the owner jumps for joy. He beats the system, so to speak. But the main point is you got to know you have worth. What I try to do with my book, Know Your Price, is give people the price to stand on, even if it means going crazy and dying. And so for regular folk, we've got to know our price. We've got to demand what we're worth, because there are people in the market who will not recognize until they are pushed to. So I would just say for everyday people, you can demand, you can make a demand. Just make sure that it's truly reflective of your value.
I like that too. Do you have advice for people who feel overwhelmed by this whole conversation, overwhelmed by all of the challenges and various types of racism that face us? Do you have any advice for those folks?
Again, I think for those who feel overwhelmed, that to remember that we are making progress, albeit slow. We are making some progress in this conversation, but I I really just believe that I'm in this world to help others. And when you have an ethic of care, of a greater sense of family, you know, you should feel compelled to do the work. It's hard, it's frustrating, it certainly will give you gray hairs. I want to be part of this struggle because I want what's best for our communities. I want what's best for our families. Put a moral frame on your actions. What should you be doing? What ought you be doing?
Okay.
And that will help guide um, you and make this work a little bit easier. But your comfort is not the gauge. It's about your purpose in life. That's far more important.
So, what gives you hope in this work that you're doing?
Oh, I get hope from the doers, the teachers, the engineers, the people in the street demanding change. Oh man, they make it possible for this policy person to get things done. Because look, nobody's paying attention to my policy briefs until people are putting demands in the street, looking for answers, and then I go, here's something you should look at. But it takes like the teachers, the engineers, the folks on the ground doing the work to do that work. And so I say, and I find inspiration in them because when folks are marching in the street, when teachers are risking their lives going into schools, I gotta play my part. You know, when we applaud essential workers and not recognize them by um, doing your best in what you do, that's a problem. And so I have to do what's what's best for our communities, and I draw inspiration from the doers in society.
Well, I love that. And thank you so much for joining us and talking about that. That is fantastic.